I stared at the documents spread across my father's antique desk, each page meticulously altered to cut me out of my inheritance. My brother Michael stood before me, practically bouncing with poorly concealed triumph. "See," he said, tapping the signature line with his index finger. "Dad signed it himself just last month. He finally realized who really deserved to run the family business. My name is Daniel Carter, and at 35, I was watching my older brother try to steal everything our father had spent his life building. The Carter Group wasn't just any company, it was a real estate empire worth over $200 million, built from the ground up by our father through decades of hard work." "Last month?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral as I examined the date on the will. "That would be while Dad was in intensive care, right?" Michael's smile faltered slightly. He had his lucid moments. I nodded slowly, thinking about the small envelope Dad had pressed into my hands 2 days before he slipped into the coma that would eventually take his life. "Don't open it until the time is right," he'd whispered, his voice weak but his eyes sharp and clear. "You'll know when." "Funny thing about ICU visits," I said, leaning back in Dad's leather chair. "They keep pretty detailed records of patients' conditions, including their consciousness levels." "What are you implying?" Michael demanded, his face flushing. I didn't answer immediately, instead looking around the office where I'd spent countless hours learning the business from Dad. Every detail was exactly as he'd left it. The scale model of our first major development on the credenza, the family photos on the walls, the ancient safe behind the monet print that Michael thought only he knew about. "I'm not implying anything," I finally replied. "I'm just surprised Dad managed to sign such an important document while he was heavily sedated and on a ventilator." Michael's hand twitched toward the will, but I was faster, sliding the papers into a folder. "I'll need to have our lawyers review these," I said calmly. "Standard procedure, you understand." "There's nothing to review," he snapped. "It's perfectly legal. Dad changed his mind about you running things. He saw how you were always questioning his decisions, always wanting to modernize and change everything. He knew I'd keep his legacy intact." I thought about the real conversations I'd had with Dad in those final months, about my plans to expand the company into sustainable development, about introducing technology that would streamline our operations. Far from rejecting these ideas, Dad had been excited about them. "You have vision, Danny," he'd said during one of our late-night strategy sessions. "Michael knows the old way of doing things, but you see where the industry is going." But Michael had never understood our father's true vision. To him, the Carter Group was a symbol of power, a way to throw his weight around in business circles. He'd never grasped that Dad's real legacy wasn't about buildings or profit margins. It was about creating something that would last, something that would make a difference in people's lives. "We should call a board meeting," Michael continued, straightening his designer tie. "Announce the changes. The sooner everyone knows I'm in charge, the better." I opened my laptop, pulling up my email. "Sure, we can do that. But first, let me show you something interesting I found in Dad's emails." Michael's face paled slightly. "You don't have access to his accounts." "Actually, I do. Dad gave me his password 6 months ago when he made me COO. He wanted me to start handling more of the day-to-day operations while he focused on his treatment." I turned the screen toward him, showing him an email chain from 3 months ago. It was between Dad and his oncologist, discussing the aggressive progression of his cancer and the likelihood that he would need intensive care soon. "The interesting thing," I said, scrolling through the messages, "is that Dad was already planning for this. He knew he might not be conscious for the end. That's why he put everything in order back then." Michael's confident smirk had completely vanished now. "What are you talking about?" I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out another set of documents, the real will, dated and notarized 3 months ago. This is Dad's actual last will and testament. Notice how the signature matches his normal handwriting, unlike the shaky scrawl on your version. "That's an old draft," Michael said quickly, but I could see the panic rising in his eyes. Dad changed his mind. Did he, while he was unconscious, or did someone else change it for him? The silence in the room was deafening. Outside, I could hear the usual bustle of the office. Phones ringing, elevators dinging, life going on as normal while my brother's scheme unraveled before his eyes. "You always were his favorite," Michael finally spat. His face twisted with bitterness. "Perfect Danny with his MBA and his innovative ideas. He never appreciated everything I did to keep things running the way he built them. That's where you're wrong, I said quietly. Dad appreciated both of us. He just understood our strengths and weaknesses better than we did. I stood up, walking to the monet print. Michael's eyes widened as I swung it aside, revealing the safe. How did you? Dad showed me where it was years ago, I said, spinning the dial with practiced ease. He wanted me to know where he kept the important things. Things like evidence of financial irregularities he discovered in some of our development projects. The safe opened with a soft click, and I removed a thick folder. Projects you were in charge of, Michael. Projects where money seemed to disappear into consulting fees and contractor overruns that Dad could never quite explain. Michael lunged for the folder, but I stepped back, keeping it out of his reach. Careful, I warned. Assaulting a company officer would look pretty bad on top of everything else. Michael sank into one of the leather chairs facing Dad's desk, his face ashen. You don't understand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I had to do it. The gambling debts, they were going to hurt me if I didn't pay. I set the folder down and opened it carefully. Inside were detailed records of every questionable transaction Michael had tried to hide over the past 5 years. Inflated contractor invoices, fake consulting fees, mysterious cash withdrawals. Dad had documented everything. How much? I asked, though I already knew the answer from Dad's meticulous notes. 3 million, Michael admitted, slumping further into the chair. Maybe 4. I lost count. I thought about the night 6 months ago when Dad had called me to his house. After he'd started his second round of chemotherapy, he'd been sitting in his study, surrounded by these same financial records. Danny, he'd said, his voice tired but determined, I need to show you something about your brother. That was the night I learned about Michael's gambling addiction, about the money he'd been siphoning from company projects to pay his debts. Dad had discovered it during a routine audit but had kept the information to himself, hoping to find a way to help Michael without destroying him. Your brother's always been driven by fear, Dad had explained. Fear of not measuring up, fear of losing control. That's why he gambles. He's trying to prove he can beat the odds, be the winner he thinks I wanted him to be. Now, watching Michael's carefully constructed facade crumble, I understood exactly what Dad had meant. The new will isn't the only document you forged, is it? I asked, pulling out more papers from the folder. There are transfer authorizations here, checks with Dad's signature, board resolutions, all from after he went into the ICU. Michael's hands began to shake. I was going to pay it back. Once I had control of the company, I could fix everything. By stealing my inheritance, by betraying Dad's wishes, I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city skyline Dad had helped shape. Did you really think you could get away with it? What choice did I have? Michael's voice cracked. They were threatening my family, my kids, Danny. What was I supposed to do? I turned back to face him, remembering something else Dad had told me during that late-night conversation. The true measure of a leader isn't how they handle success, but how they handle failure. You could have come to me, I said quietly, or to Dad before he got sick. We would have helped you. Right? Michael laughed bitterly. Perfect Danny to the rescue again. Is that what you want to hear? I pulled out the envelope Dad had given me just before his coma, the one he told me not to open until the time was right. Now was that time. Inside were 2 letters. The first was addressed to me. Dear Danny, if you're reading this, then everything has happened as I feared it might. Your brother's desperation has driven him to try something reckless, probably involving the company and his inheritance. I've known about Michael's gambling for longer than he realizes. I've watched him dig himself deeper and deeper, too proud or too ashamed to ask for help. I tried to protect him, to give him chances to come clean, but sometimes protecting someone means letting them face the consequences of their actions. The second letter in this envelope is for Michael. It contains something he needs more than money or power, the truth about why I made the choices I did. Whatever he's done, remember that he's still your brother. Handle this the way I taught you, with wisdom, compassion, and an eye toward the future. Love, Dad. I opened the second letter and held it out to Michael. His hands trembled as he took it. What is this? He asked, staring at the envelope like it might bite him. Read it, I said. Dad wrote it for you, knowing this day might come. Michael's face went through a range of emotions as he read. Shock, shame, grief, and finally something that looked like acceptance. He knew, he whispered. He knew everything, and he still loved you. I finished. Of course he did. You're his son. Michael covered his face with his hands, and for the first time since we were kids, I saw my brother cry. The silence in Dad's office stretched on as Michael wiped his eyes, still clutching Dad's letter like a lifeline. Through the windows, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, making everything feel somehow more intimate, more raw. Want to tell me what Dad wrote? I asked quietly, pouring 2 glasses of Dad's favorite scotch from the crystal decanter he kept on his credenza. Michael took a shaky breath, accepting the glass I offered. He wrote about the first development project he ever gave me to manage, the Richmond Heights complex. I remembered it well. Michael had been 28, eager to prove himself. The project had gone over budget, missed deadlines, and nearly cost us a major investor. At the time, Dad had seemed surprisingly calm about the whole thing. He knew I falsified the reports back then, Michael continued. Knew I was trying to cover up my mistakes, but instead of confronting me, he wrote that he waited to see what I would do next. And what did you do? I asked, though I already knew the story. I borrowed money to fix it, started gambling, thinking I could win enough to cover the losses before anyone found out. Michael took a long drink. One debt led to another, and soon I was in so deep I couldn't see a way out. I sat down across from him, remembering how Dad had handled that situation. He quietly restructured the project, brought in additional support, and never once mentioned Michael's deception. Dad wrote that he blamed himself. Michael said, his voice rough, said he put too much pressure on me too soon, made me feel like I couldn't fail. Said he should have taught me that failure is part of learning, not a measure of worth. The words hit home. Dad had taught me that lesson early, letting me make small mistakes and learn from them. But with Michael, his firstborn, he'd been different, more demanding, less forgiving. It wasn't until later years that he recognized the damage that approach had caused. There's more, Michael said, smoothing the letter with trembling hands. He wrote about Mom. Our mother had died when we were young. Michael was 12. I was 8. She'd been the one who usually cushioned Dad's expectations, who helped us understand his tough love came from a place of caring. He said after Mom died, he was so afraid of losing us too that he tried to control everything. With me especially, he thought if he could make me strong enough, successful enough, nothing could hurt me. Michael's laugh was hollow. Instead, he just made me afraid of being weak. I stood up and walked to the wall of family photos, finding one from just after Mom's funeral. Dad stood between us, one hand on each of our shoulders, trying to look strong for his boys while his world was falling apart. You know what else is in that folder? I asked, turning back to Michael. He shook his head. A recovery plan. Dad spent months working with financial advisors and addiction specialists, setting up a program to help you. There's a trust fund specifically for paying off your gambling debts, but it comes with conditions. Therapy, Gamblers Anonymous, financial oversight. Michael's head snapped up. What? I pulled out more documents from the folder. He knew you'd never ask for help voluntarily, so he made sure it would be there when you finally hit bottom. But after everything I did, the forged will, the stolen money. Dad understood addiction, Michael, better than either of us knew. I handed him another document, an old newspaper clipping about our grandfather's struggle with alcoholism. It's what killed Grandpa. Dad spent his whole life trying to make sure we didn't follow that path. What happens now? Michael asked, looking lost. I sat on the edge of Dad's desk. That depends on you. The trust fund is still there. The help is still available. But you have to want it. And the company? Dad's real will stands. I'll take over as CEO, but there's a place for you here, after rehabilitation with supervision. Dad believed in second chances, and so do I. Michael stared at his empty glass. The men I owe money to, they won't wait for me to go through rehab. They've already been paid, I said quietly. Dad took care of it before he went into the hospital. One last protection for his son. The tears started again, but different this time. Not tears of shame or fear, but of recognition, finally understanding the depth of our father's love. I need help. Danny, Michael whispered, I can't do this alone. You don't have to. The next few months were hard. Michael entered a residential treatment program. while I took control of the Carter Group. We hired forensic accountants to track down every penny that had been misappropriated, setting up repayment plans where needed. The board was surprisingly supportive once they understood the situation. Many of them had worked with Dad for decades and recognized his philosophy in how we were handling things. 6 months later, I sat in what was now my office, looking at an email from Michael's therapist. He was doing well, taking his recovery seriously. He'd started mentoring other addicts, using his story to help them face their own demons. I opened Dad's safe. I kept it in the same place and pulled out one final letter he'd left. This one was addressed to both of us. My boys, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened, but also the best. The worst because your brother's addiction finally came to a head, but the best because you found your way through it together. Danny, I knew you would handle things with the wisdom and compassion I always saw in you. Your strength isn't in being perfect, it's in understanding that nobody is. Michael, my firstborn, I hope you finally understood that my love for you was never conditional on your success. Your worth isn't measured in achievements or failures, but in your capacity to learn and grow from both. Together, you two have the potential to take the Carter Group further than I ever could. Danny's vision combined with Michael's experience, once he's healthy again, could be extraordinary. But more importantly, you have the chance to heal what's been broken in our family for generations. The cycle of addiction, of hiding pain behind pride, of fathers and sons unable to show their love. It can end with you. Remember that buildings rise and fall, fortunes come and go, but family, real family, bound by love and understanding, that's what lasts. All my love, Dad. I folded the letter carefully and looked out at the city skyline. Somewhere out there, Michael was fighting his daily battle for recovery. Meanwhile, I was here, protecting what Dad had built while preparing it for the future. We weren't the same people we'd been when this all started. Maybe that was Dad's real legacy, not the company or the buildings, but the understanding that sometimes you have to break apart to come back stronger. I picked up my phone and dialed Michael's number. It was time for our weekly call, where we talked about everything and nothing, recovery and business, memories and hopes, the past we were healing and the future we were building. Dad had been right. Buildings rise and fall, but family endures.